There is a particular kind of woman who spends her whole life holding other people's hands and never notices that nobody is holding hers. Margaret Delacroix was 28, a hospice nurse in Baltimore. By day, she in pale blue scrubs gently accompanied dying souls through their final hours. By night, she returned to a lavish, gated home in Roland Park, stepping into a living nightmare. Her husband was Maryland's most celebrated cardiac surgeon, a man praised for his golden hands by day, who knew with surgical precision exactly where to strike at night, so no mark would ever show. For 5 years, she bled in silence, hiding her bruises beneath long sleeves and flawless smiles, enduring everything to protect the one person left in the world she loved. Then came a violent night that brought her to her knees on the cold floor, utterly broken, wishing only for the pain to end. But as her husband raised his hand to strike once more, expecting her usual surrender, 3 unhurried knocks echoed through the hallway. No one knocks in Roland Park without permission. Yet when the heavy doors opened, standing in the doorway was Augustin Fontaine, a man who owned the Baltimore waterfront, with a cold, terrifying authority. He hadn't come as a savior. He had come to collect a debt her husband could never repay. But when his eyes fell upon the terrified woman bleeding on the marble floor, something far deeper shifted in the air, because 18 months earlier, an old woman in room 709 had held Margaret's hand in her final hours and left a yellowed envelope for her grandson, a final wish that was about to bring an entire empire to its knees. If stories about dignity, retribution, and the powerful light that emerges from the darkest places move your heart, tap that like button, share this video, and subscribe so you never miss a chapter. Now, let's go back to the beginning, to a quiet nurse who had no idea her world was about to collide with a force no one saw coming. The 7th floor of St. Ambrose Hospital had always been different from all the others, and anyone who worked there long enough understood that without needing to be told, this wasn't a place where people came to be healed, but a place where they came to leave this world with dignity. And among those quiet rooms, Margaret moved softly, like a shadow that had memorized every brick. That night, when the entire city had fallen asleep, and the hallway held nothing but the steady beeping of heart monitors, she remained beside the bed of an elderly man whose children and grandchildren were still stranded at some airport thousands of miles away. Her shift had ended long ago. No one paid her an extra cent for hours like these, and she'd never once thought of asking. The old man was no longer conscious, his breathing as thin as a thread about to break, but his hand still held tightly to hers, and Margaret knew that somewhere deep inside, he could still hear her. She began to hum an old melody, a French lullaby her mother had sung to her when she was a child, so softly that only the man lying in the bed could hear it, and she kept singing until that fragile thread gently slipped away, and the room sank into a different kind of silence, deeper, more final. She didn't pull her hand away at once. She sat there a little longer in the darkness, as though she wanted to be certain he'd reached the place he was meant to go. And only then did she close his eyes and draw the blanket up over him. To Margaret, a human being didn't lose their worth simply because they could no longer do anything for anyone else. The world outside might measure a person by what they produced, but here on the 7th floor, she measured them by something else, by whether someone was there beside them in their final hour. And for many years, she had willingly chosen to be that person. When she stepped out to the nurse's station, Adeline Barnaby was sitting there, her eyes as sharp as knives, the eyes of a woman who had spent nearly a lifetime in the profession and had seen far too much to be easily deceived anymore. She said nothing. She merely glanced toward the room whose door had just closed, then looked back at Margaret, and there was something in her gaze that was both gentle and searching, the kind of look that lingered longer than any ordinary question required. Adeline always looked at her that way, as though she were trying to read a page someone had deliberately written in fading ink. Margaret lowered her head, opened the bottom drawer beneath the desk, and took out a small notebook with a worn cover, a notebook no one else knew existed. Inside were names, page after page, the names of every person she had accompanied through death over all those years, each one followed by a small detail so she would never forget that they had been more than a number on a chartboard. One had loved country music, another had been afraid of lying in the dark, another had a daughter whose name he kept calling until the very end. She turned to a blank page, picked up her pencil, and added the name of the old man who had just passed away, along with the detail that he had waited for children who hadn't made it home in time. Then her eyes accidentally settled on the bottom line of the page, where, a long time ago, she had written another name in pencil, her own, and beside it was a faint stroke drawn across the words, as though some part of her had quietly placed herself among those who were waiting for their turn. She didn't allow herself to look at it for long. She closed the notebook and returned it to its hiding place just as Adeline rose, walked around the desk, and came closer, close enough for a perceptive person to notice what everyone else had missed. And almost by instinct, without thinking, Margaret reached up and tugged the sleeve of her white coat a little lower, covering her wrist completely, hiding the thing she had concealed for so long that the motion had become part of who she was, as natural as breathing, and as lonely as a lie no one cared enough to hear. A few days after that night on the 7th floor, the city held a fundraising gala for the hospital, and Margaret was forced to appear beside her husband in a floor-length emerald gown he had chosen himself. The hotel ballroom blazed beneath crystal chandeliers. Wine glasses chimed brightly against one another, and in the midst of all that splendor, Brannon Whitmore stood on the stage as though the entire room had been built merely to serve as his backdrop. People called him the Golden Hands of Maryland, and the name hadn't come without reason, because that very morning, those hands had opened the chest of a stranger, repaired a heart that had nearly stopped beating, and returned that man to his family. When he stepped forward to receive the applause, the entire room rose to its feet, and cameras flashed without pause like a storm of white light. Margaret sat in the front row, smiling at the right moments, clapping at the proper rhythm, doing everything a perfect wife was supposed to do, and not one person in that crowded room could have guessed that inside her mouth, close against her cheek, there was a small tear that still hadn't healed, a wound she had to be careful not to touch with her tongue whenever she spoke or smiled, a wound known only to her. When the speech ended, Brannon came down from the stage and found his way back to her like a magnet returning to its rightful place beneath the gaze of the crowd, then slipped an arm behind her back and drew her close so the reporters could capture a photograph of them together. His hand rested against her back, and to everyone watching, it looked like the tender gesture of a husband who loved his wife. Only Margaret knew that his palm had settled on the exact spot where, just a few nights earlier, she hadn't dared lie on that side, a place that still throbbed beneath the thin silk of her dress, and she understood that the way his fingertips pressed lightly into it wasn't accidental. It was a reminder, a private language only the two of them understood, spoken in the middle of hundreds of people without a single soul hearing it. She smiled for the cameras, a smile practiced until it had become flawless, and in that burst of flashing light, their image was preserved as the thing the entire city would see on the cover of next month's magazine. A golden couple, a fairy tale made real. No one saw the truth, that the man who saved lives on the operating table while daylight still filled the sky was the same man who closed the bedroom door with exquisite care after nightfall, so softly that not a sound escaped, like someone who knew exactly what he was doing and exactly how to make sure no one ever found out. It was that contrast that terrified Margaret more than anything else, because a man who was openly cruel could still be exposed, but a man who could pass from savior to something else, in the single instant it took to cross the threshold of his own home, was the kind of man no one would believe her capable of describing. He understood the human body better than almost anyone. Every tendon, every muscle, every fragile seam of flesh, knew where it could endure and where it would leave a mark, and he used that knowledge with the cold precision of a sculptor who understood which part of the stone would never be revealed beneath the light. That night, on the drive home, sitting beside him in the car as it glided through rain-slick streets, Margaret watched her faint reflection in the window, the woman from the photograph taken only moments before, the woman the whole world admired, and wondered how long it had been since she had recognized her own face, how long her smile had been nothing more than something she put on like a mask, and whether there was still anyone in the world who would look at her long enough to see what lay beneath it. There was only one place in the world where Margaret allowed herself to breathe, and that was the sunlit room at Rosewood Nursing Center, where her younger brother lived. Theodore had just turned 19, and although his body had stopped obeying him after an incident in childhood, although every movement was a grueling negotiation with his own rigid muscles, his eyes still shone with an intelligence no illness had ever been able to touch. That afternoon, when Margaret walked in, his face lit up, and he immediately shifted his gaze toward the screen mounted on his wheelchair, the device that allowed him to select each letter with his eyes and slowly piece them together into words. She pulled a chair beside him, and while she waited for him to type, her gaze drifted across the drawings covering one section of the wall, because Theodore drew, and he drew often, creating rough, uneven strokes of color with the help of a special assistive device, and to her, Every picture was a doorway into the vibrant world, moving restlessly behind that quiet forehead. He finished typing, and the machine read the sentence aloud in its familiar, even voice, saying that he had carefully considered the matter and concluded that her new hairstyle made it look as though she had picked a fight with a hairdryer and lost. Margaret burst out laughing, a real laugh, one that rose unexpectedly from some deep place she had believed sealed shut long ago, and she reached out to pinch his ear gently, scolding him with affection that the older he got, the more insolent he became. Theodore narrowed his eyes with delight, wearing the mischievous look of a young man who knew perfectly well that he had scored a point. In that room, she wasn't the perfect wife on the cover of a magazine, nor was she the silent shadow on the 7th floor. She was simply Teddy's sister, the only person in the world who still called him by that tender name, and he was the only person who still saw her exactly as she truly was. They talked about everything. About a bird building its nest outside his window, about the novel she read to him, a little at a time whenever she visited. And for those brief moments, the two of them almost forgot that the world beyond that door followed far crueler rules. But eventually, the time came for her to leave, and when she kissed his forehead and stepped through the gates, the reality she had tried to push aside came rushing back, heavy as a soaked coat. Sitting in the car beside Brannon, she mentioned Rosewood's monthly fees in the cautious tone she had grown accustomed to using, the voice of someone who knew she was walking across thin ice, and asked whether the transfer could be made a few days earlier that month because the center had sent a reminder. He didn't take his eyes off the road ahead. The corner of his mouth lifted into the faint smile she had learned to fear, and in a voice so calm it was chilling, he told her she was free to leave whenever she wanted, that he never stopped anyone from going, but that on Monday he would cancel the transfer order, and by the end of the week she would have to find another place for the boy herself, somewhere that fit a nurse's salary. He said it as casually as though he were commenting on the weather, and that very casualness made it the sharpest weapon he had ever used, because he knew exactly what she feared more than her own pain. Margaret turned toward the window and clenched both hands in her lap until her knuckles turned white. And in that moment, she understood more clearly than ever that the chain binding her to that house had never been love, nor had it ever been weakness, as outsiders might have assumed. That chain had a face, a mischievous smile, and bright eyes shining beneath a quiet forehead, and she knew that for the sake of those eyes, she would keep enduring, keep staying, keep bowing her head for as long as she had to, as long as her brother could remain in that sunlit room with the bird building its nest outside the window. To understand why Margaret had ended up on the 7th floor of St. Ambrose in the first place, one had to go back many years, to a winter afternoon when she was still a little girl and her world shattered inside that very building. Her mother had been brought to St. Ambrose for what everyone said was a simple operation, a routine procedure that countless people underwent before going home the next day, and the child Margaret had sat waiting in the hallway, swinging legs that didn't yet reach the floor, certain that in just a little while her mother would be wheeled out and smile at her as she always did. But her mother was never wheeled out again. Something had happened behind the operating room doors, something that even years later, after Margaret had grown into a woman, she still couldn't piece together completely. She remembered only fragments, the faces of adults bending toward her and speaking in that falsely gentle voice every child instinctively understands, as a warning of something terrible. The long hours she spent alone that night in a strange place, steeped in the smell of antiseptic, and the knowledge that her mother had died somewhere very close, only a few steps away, without anyone holding her hand. That thought drove itself into Margaret's heart and remained there throughout her childhood, the thought that her mother had gone alone. And when she grew older and reached the crossroads where she had to choose a path for her life, Margaret didn't become a nurse for the salary or the prestige. She chose it for a reason so simple it was heartbreaking, a reason she had dared to speak aloud only once to her closest friend during their school years, that she wanted to work in the very place where her mother had died, so that from then on, no one else would ever have to leave this world alone the way her mother had. It became the silent vow of her entire life, and she kept it through every night shift and every hand she held in the darkness. She met Brannon Whitmore in that same hospital, when he was already a celebrated surgeon, and she was only a young nurse, and he pursued her with all the charm a man at the height of power knew how to display, with bouquets of flowers, elegant dinners, promises of a home, and she, a girl who had lost her mother in childhood and had always longed for somewhere to belong, believed him. He loved her, or loved something close enough to love, the kind of feeling a man developed when he was accustomed to possessing beautiful things. and during the first months of their marriage, she had almost dared to believe that her life had finally turned to a different page. Then one evening, about 6 months after the wedding, Margaret hung several old family photographs on the bedroom wall, as any wife might do when trying to bring some warmth from the past into a new home, and she saw Brannon stop in front of a picture of her as a child, standing beside her mother. He remained there for a very long time, strangely long, his face going blank as though he had just seen a ghost step out from behind the glass. And when she asked him what was wrong, he only shook his head and walked out without saying a word. She didn't understand. How could she have understood that the man had just recognized the face of the woman in the photograph? That among the hundreds of patients who had passed through his hands, there was one he could never allow himself to remember, and that this woman was the mother of the wife who slept beside him every night. That very night, something inside him broke and never mended again. The first time he struck her was that same night, so sudden and without reason that Margaret was left stunned. And in the long years that followed, she exhausted herself searching for an explanation, blaming herself for something she must have done, or some wrong words she must have spoken, never suspecting that her only offense had been hanging on the wall the face of a woman her husband needed to forget at any cost, and that her entire marriage, every beating endured in silence, had all begun with a secret known only to him. The years after that fateful night passed not like a violent storm, but like cold water rising a little higher each day, so quietly that Margaret barely realized she was slowly drowning until it had already reached her throat. She couldn't identify the exact moment when she began to change. She knew only that, little by little, she learned things no wife should ever have had to learn. She learned to avoid the elevator and take the stairs whenever she needed to hide her limp from the eyes of her colleagues. She learned to wake before dawn, while the entire house was still buried in darkness, and quietly tend to the painful places on her own body with the same hands that had cared for so many others, working with such skill and composure that it might have been the body of a stranger rather than her own. She learned to answer the question, "Are you all right?" with a smile measured to the smallest degree, not so bright that anyone might suspect it was false, but not so faint that someone would feel compelled to look at her a second time. She became a master of concealment, an artist of long sleeves and carefully prepared explanations. And if there was one thing more frightening than everything that had happened to her, it was that all those skills gradually became so natural that she no longer had to think about them. She didn't live in fear, because fear was still far too vivid an emotion for what she had become. She lived by routine, through a chain of repeated movements that carried her from one day to the next without forcing her to feel. And a person who lives only by routine has lost something even greater than safety. They have lost the ability to believe that tomorrow might be different. It was in the midst of those gray, airless days, about a year and a half before the fateful stormy night, that a patient was admitted to room 709 on the 7th floor, and Margaret's life brushed against something she could never have anticipated. The old woman's name was Odette Fontaine. She was nearly 90 years old, a Corsican woman whose voice still carried the music of a distant sea, and whose eyes remained sharp, despite the fact that her body had nearly exhausted all its strength. She didn't have much time left, and she knew it clearly, but she showed none of the weary resignation of someone waiting to die. Instead, she watched everything around her with the clear sight of a woman who had lived long enough to see through every disguise, and she saw Margaret, not the devoted nurse with the flawless smile everyone else saw, but the real woman beneath the mask. From the first few days, when Margaret leaned over to adjust her pillow, those aged eyes caught a fleeting glimpse of something near her wrist, something countless doctors and colleagues had passed by every day and chosen not to notice, and Odette was the first person who didn't turn away. She asked no questions, demanded no explanations, and offered no judgment. She only looked at Margaret with such gentle understanding that Margaret had to turn away quickly for fear she would break apart. During those final weeks, a quiet but profound affection grew between the two women, despite the nearly full lifetime that separated them, and Margaret found herself longing for each shift, simply so she could sit beside Odette and listen to her speak of the island where she had been born, and of the fierce, restless years of her youth. Then the final night came. Margaret remained long after her shift had ended, sitting beside the bed in the dim light, and as she always did for those nearing the end, she softly sang the old French lullaby her mother had left behind. Odette listened with her eyes half closed, and when the melody ended, the old woman gently tightened her fingers around Margaret's hand with the last of her strength. Then, in French, she whispered a question that seemed to stop Margaret's heart. "My child, Has anyone ever sung for you? In that moment, something that had been frozen inside Margaret for so many years suddenly began to melt. She lowered her head beside the old woman's thin hand and wept, truly wept for the first time in all those years, shedding the tears she had never permitted herself to cry. Odette said nothing more. She simply placed her other hand upon Margaret's hair and stroked it softly, like a mother soothing her child. And in that way, before the first light of dawn could appear beyond the window, the old woman slipped away, leaving behind in the heart of the young nurse a question she would carry with her for a very long time. Not far from the quiet 7th floor of St. Ambrose, in another corner of the city where the hospital lights could never reach, Baltimore Harbor at night belonged to an entirely different world, a world of iron and steel, of shipping containers stacked as high as mountains, and enormous vessels lying motionless upon the black water. Near midnight at Pier 4, amid the damp cold rising from the bay, a man sat on a simple metal folding chair that seemed strangely out of place in such surroundings, both hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee that had already gone cold, quietly listening. Augustin Fontaine didn't look the way people usually imagined a kingpin would. He wasn't towering or savage. He didn't flaunt himself, and he had no need for threatening gestures, because true power had never needed to raise its voice. He merely sat there, his black hair still beneath the harsh overhead lights, the thin scar running along his left eyebrow shifting faintly, as his calm, dark brown eyes watched the man standing before him, a man sweating more heavily by the moment, despite the freezing air. He owned a small shipping company that operated at the harbor, and he was speaking without pause, trying to justify the fact that he had falsified the weight of his cargo shipments for months, reporting them as lighter so he could reduce the amount owed to the dockworkers' union, to the laborers who worked beneath the sun and sweated to provide for their families. He offered every excuse he could find, saying the market was difficult, expenses had risen, and everyone else did the same thing, and Gus allowed him to speak without interrupting once, occasionally taking a sip of his coffee, patient as a man who had grown accustomed to watching others dig their own graves. Only when the man finally ran out of words and stood there breathing heavily in the terrifying silence did Gus slowly set his coffee on the concrete floor, lift his head, and look directly into his eyes. In a voice so low and quiet that the other man had to lean forward to hear him, Gus said that he wasn't troubled by the fact that the man had taken the money, because everyone in this world was greedy for money. But what troubled him was that the man had dared to believe Gus wouldn't count it. It was only one sentence, with no threat and no raised hand. Yet the man's face drained of color, because he understood that the judgment just passed wasn't about the money, but about his entire future at the harbor. And indeed, the following morning, the shipping company received notice that its docking privileges had been revoked, without fanfare, without explanation, as though its name had never existed on the waterfront at all. But what few people noticed, what set Augustin Fontaine apart, was that by that very morning, every worker who had once been employed by the company, innocent people who knew nothing beyond working hard to support themselves, had been approached by Gus's men and offered jobs at other docks without a single reduction in pay. Because under the harsh code he had created for himself, he could crush a man who dared deceive him, but he would never take food from the tables of the families standing behind that man. He destroyed one person, not an entire home. When the workers had dispersed, and the harbor had once again fallen into silence, a figure emerged from the darkness and approached. It was Fitz, his quiet and loyal right hand, a broad-shouldered man of few words. Fitz didn't say much. He simply handed Gus a thin file. And as Gus turned through the pages beneath the sickly yellow light, Fitz quietly explained that it concerned a debtor who had been hiding for far too long, a prominent physician in the city named Whitmore, a man who had borrowed a large sum through channels that were far from clean, and then tried to deny the debt. The meeting to collect what was owed had been arranged for the following evening. Gus closed the file, his eyes narrowing slightly at the name printed on the cover, and gave a faint nod, never suspecting that this name, which seemed to belong to nothing more than an ordinary debtor, was about to lead him to a door behind which fate was waiting for him in a way that even a man who had crossed every dangerous road in life could never have foreseen. On the 9th of March, the following evening that fate had quietly appointed long before, it began with a storm. The rain didn't fall so much as lash against the great windows of the house in Roland Park, striking them in violent waves and shrieking through the cracks around the doors, as though something outside were trying to force its way in. And within that atmosphere stretched taut as a wire, Margaret knew from the moment she heard Brannon's car turn into the driveway that something was terribly wrong. She had learned to read it over the years, in the way he shut the car door, in the rhythm of his footsteps along the path, and that night every sign warned of a storm. He had discovered that she had secretly used a small amount of her own money to pay for medicine for an elderly patient on the 7th floor. A man with no insurance and no family, someone who would have been forced to spend his final days in pain without that medication. To Margaret, it had been nothing more than the obvious thing to do, a small act of compassion. But to Brannon, it was betrayal, proof that she still possessed some private corner of her life beyond his control, and nothing enraged him more. His anger that night didn't arrive like an explosion, but like a tide rising slowly and coldly. And Margaret, who had memorized every shade of her husband's cruelty, understood that this night would be different. She would never recount what happened afterward, because there are some things words should never be made to touch. She knew only that the vast house filled with scattered sounds, the shattering of something made of glass against the floor as it broke into countless tiny pieces, the weight of footsteps moving slowly across the hardwood, and beneath it all, steady and indifferent, the ticking of the clock on the living room wall, calmly counting the passing seconds as though nothing at all were happening. Then, at some point, Margaret found herself lying on the cold tile floor of the kitchen, her cheek pressed against the cool marble, and that chill spread through her body with a sensation that was almost comforting, a numbness that received her like a blanket. She lay still, with no strength left to resist and no tears left to shed, while everything inside her mind became strangely quiet. She thought of her younger brother, of Teddy's bright eyes, and she thought of her mother, of the question the old Corsican woman had asked, the question she still hadn't found an answer to. And then, for the first time in a life spent bracing herself to endure, Margaret let go. She didn't beg for the pain to end, nor did she pray to be rescued. She merely closed her eyes and breathed out a silent prayer deep within herself, asking for the strength to survive the night, or that the overwhelming darkness around her might finally dissolve into quiet peace. It was the farthest edge a human soul could reach, the boundary where hope had been completely exhausted, and Margaret stood upon that precipice, ready to surrender herself to it. But in the very moment when everything seemed to be over, just as the silent prayer faded from her lips, another sound rang out, so out of place that it cut straight through the haze surrounding her. 3 knocks upon the front door, slow, measured, and patient. The sound of someone who had no intention of asking anyone's permission. And from the cold floor, through barely opened eyes, Margaret saw her husband suddenly stop in the middle of the room, his entire body going rigid like a man who had just heard the footsteps of fate, and for the first time in all those years, she saw something on his perpetually cold and triumphant face that she had never seen before. Fear. Those 3 knocks hung in the air for a long moment, and then, from the other side of the heavy wooden door, a voice was heard, a man's voice, low and unnervingly calm, never raised, never threatening, but composed and courteous, as though its owner were waiting in the lobby of an elegant hotel, rather than on the porch of a house in the middle of a storm. That voice spoke Brannon's name with perfect precision, and remarked that an appointment had been arranged. Yet the esteemed doctor hadn't bothered to appear, and that making someone wait in vain was a very impolite way to conduct oneself. Every word was spoken slowly and with impeccable civility, and it was that very civility that made the words more chilling than any threat could have been. Margaret, still lying motionless on the cold tile floor, felt the shift in the air even before she understood what was happening. She saw Brannon stagger back 1 step, then another, his face now drained utterly white, not a trace of blood left in it, and the hands that were always so steady over an operating table had begun to tremble uncontrollably. His eyes darted around the room like those of an animal cornered, and then, in panic, he reached behind his back and pulled a black handgun from the waistband of his trousers, a weapon Margaret hadn't even known he kept hidden in the house all this time. His hand clamped around the grip, but it still shook too violently to hold it steady, and she realized that the terror overtaking him was far greater than whatever false courage the gun was meant to provide. That was his true nature, a man who was brave only when facing those weaker than himself, and who shrank into a cowardly creature the moment death knocked at his door. For an instant, he considered leaving the door shut and silent, but then the fear that it might be broken down, the fear of being forced to face something beyond his control, drove him toward the decision of a desperate man, that it was better to open the door himself and try to bargain than to sit there waiting for disaster to crash in. With his other hand still trembling, he turned the lock and pulled the door open. Cold wind and the damp breath of rain rushed in first, and then two figures crossed the threshold. Fitz entered first, quiet and solid as a wall, and directly behind him came Augustin Fontaine, carrying that same composed presence, his dark brown eyes sweeping once across the luxurious room, and in that single glance, taking in everything. Brannon stammered something about the gun, pointing it uselessly ahead of him, but Gus didn't even bother to look at it, as though a trembling man aiming a weapon at him was no more worthy of concern than the rain falling beyond the door. Then Gus's gaze stopped. It stopped at a point on the floor, where amid the scattered shards of broken glass, a woman lay curled in on herself. In a single instant, something changed in the room, a change no machine could have measured, yet everyone present could feel it, as though the temperature of the entire space had suddenly dropped by several degrees. The polite indifference on Gus's face vanished, giving way to something far more frightening, a terrible stillness. He didn't shout, he didn't blaze with open fury. He merely turned his eyes slowly toward Brannon and asked, very softly, so softly Margaret had to strain to hear him, who had done this to her. Brannon, still not understanding that this quiet question was the most dangerous thing of all, hurriedly stammered out the same refrain he had used for years, that she had only slipped and fallen by accident. Gus was silent for a moment, his eyes never leaving the motionless body on the floor, and when he finally answered, his voice was still gentle, but cold as ice, saying that he'd heard that answer too many times in his life, and not once had it ever been the truth. Gus's cold reply struck Brannon like a bucket of water thrown straight into his face, and in that moment, he understood that the lies that had protected him for so many years had suddenly become useless before this man. Panic surged through him, and like a cornered animal that had lost all reason, he abandoned every pretense of resistance. The gun in his hand lowered, then slipped from his trembling fingers and struck the floor with a dry, hard sound. He began to speak, the words pouring out of him in a torrent, his voice now shrill and breathless with fear, saying that he would pay, that he would repay everything, if only they gave him a little more time. He promised to sign over the magnificent house, the luxury cars in the garage, even his ownership stake in the prestigious private clinic where he was a partner. He listed everything he possessed like a man emptying his pockets before a robber, his eyes pleading and his voice begging. But Gus only stood there in silence, his face revealing no emotion at all, allowing Brannon to expose the full depth of his wretchedness. And then, when all his bargaining over money still failed to disturb that terrifying composure, Brannon did something that seemed to make the entire room stop breathing. Slowly, he collapsed to his knees, the joints striking the floor among the broken shards. And from that contemptible, groveling position, he looked up, then raised one hand and pointed toward the woman who still lay motionless on the floor, toward the wife he had once vowed to love and protect. He spoke, and what came from his mouth was the lowest depth of depravity a human being could reach. He offered her as payment for his debt, surrendering her as though she were nothing more than an object, a piece of property that could be transferred from one owner to another, so he could escape what he owed and preserve his miserable life. The moment those words left him, the entire room sank into a silence so thick it seemed almost solid, a deadly silence heavier than the storm raging outside. Fitz, the powerfully built man standing guard at the doorway, had walked through every dark corner life could offer, and witnessed so many crimes that he might have believed nothing could make him flinch anymore. Yet even he turned his face slightly away, his jaw tightening, his eyes showing a disgust he couldn't conceal, as though the very presence of the creature kneeling on the floor had polluted the air he breathed. And Margaret, drifting through a haze of pain, heard every word her husband had spoken, and a freezing humiliation, more piercing than any wound on her body, spread through the depths of her soul. She had believed she had already reached the bottom of the contempt that man held for her, but there was still another level beneath it, one she had never known existed. Gus still didn't touch him. He didn't rush forward, didn't raise a hand, didn't do any of the things a man of his power could have done to the wretched creature kneeling at his feet. To Gus, someone like Brannon wasn't even worth dirtying his hands over. He merely looked down at him from above, his dark brown eyes now holding a contempt so profound that it was a judgment in itself. And in that same quiet, measured voice, he slowly told Brannon that just moments ago, he had personally revealed to the entire world exactly what he was truly worth. The words left Brannon speechless. His mouth opened and closed again, and in his eyes appeared the belated realization that he had just lost the last thing he still possessed, the one thing no amount of money could ever buy back. After those words, Gus didn't spare Brannon another glance, as though the man kneeling on the floor had become something invisible. He turned away and walked slowly toward the woman curled among the broken shards. Then he did something no one in the room had expected. The most powerful man at the harbor, a man whose single nod could determine another person's fate, slowly lowered himself to one knee beside her, bringing himself down until his eyes were level with hers, never looking down at her from above as the rest of the world always had. He didn't reach out to touch her, didn't make a single movement that might frighten her, because through some instinct, he understood that a man's hand extended toward her now, no matter how kindly meant, might cause her to shrink away. Instead, he quietly drew a spotless white handkerchief from the breast pocket of his coat, neatly folded, and gently placed it on the floor within her reach, a gesture so careful and respectful that Margaret stared at him in disbelief. Then he spoke her name, but not the name tied to the man who had caused all this suffering. He called her by her maiden name, the name of the girl who had existed before every tragedy began, the name no one had spoken in a very long time. Hearing her own name from the lips of a complete stranger, Margaret froze, her swollen eyes widening as she looked at him, filled with confusion, and with a faint glimmer of something very much like hope. She couldn't understand how this man knew her, or why there was something almost tender in those dark brown eyes. As though answering the question she hadn't yet managed to ask, Gus slowly reached inside his coat and took out something else, an envelope yellowed with age, its edges worn from having been held many times. He cradled it in his hand for a moment, and a sorrow Margaret couldn't decipher passed across his face. Then he opened it and drew out an old sheet of paper. In a deep, warm voice, now softened of its icy edge, he began to read the words written there, shaky, uneven handwriting formed by a hand that had nearly exhausted its strength, but had still struggled to shape every letter with care. They were the words of an old woman, written during the final days of her life from a room numbered 709. She had written to her grandson, telling him that in the room beside hers there was a young nurse, a girl with gentle hands and a heart she believed was rare in this world, a girl who had stayed late into the night to sing for her when she should already have gone home. She wrote that the young woman carried a pain she was trying desperately to hide, that she had seen the bruises concealed beneath her sleeves, and that she knew those marks hadn't been caused by an accident. She was old, exhausted, and no longer had enough time to do anything herself for that poor girl, so she entrusted her final wish to her grandson, begging him to keep watch over her, to find some way to help her, and not let her carry that regret into the next world. Gus read every word softly into the deathly silent room, and with each sentence, something inside Margaret's chest broke apart. She recognized the Corsican woman at once, the woman who had asked the question Margaret still carried with her every night. And she understood that even in the last moments of her life, in the midst of terrible suffering, that old woman had still been worried about her. There had been someone, just one person in the entire world, who had seen her pain and hadn't turned away. Faced with that truth, every wall Margaret had spent so many years building to protect herself finally collapsed completely. She began to weep, sobs rising from her that she couldn't contain, crying for the old woman, crying for herself, and crying because for the first time after so many years buried in darkness, someone had finally seen her, not as a perfect wife, not as a silent shadow, but as a human being. As Margaret's sobs gradually subsided, Gus remained kneeling beside her, and for a long while he said nothing, only watched her in silence with an expression she couldn't understand, an expression weighed down by something that looked almost like remorse. Then he began to speak, his voice now low, rough, and slower than before, as though every word he was about to say carried a price, and what he confessed sent a chill through Margaret's entire body. He told her that after reading his grandmother's final wish, he hadn't hesitated. He had ordered his people to investigate, and within only a few days, he had discovered who she was and where she worked. He told her that he had gone to the hospital himself, had made his way all the way up to the 7th floor, and had stood there in that very hallway, no more than 15 steps away from her. At those words, Margaret went still. She searched her memory desperately but couldn't recall ever seeing this man before, and as though he could read her thoughts, Gus quietly told her that she wouldn't remember, because she had been occupied with her work and had no reason to notice a stranger standing silently at the far end of the corridor. He had stood there, he continued, and watched her at the nurse's station. But he hadn't seen a woman being tormented. What he had seen was her smiling and speaking with a tall man in a white coat. A doctor he later learned was her husband, and she had handed him a cup of coffee with such natural ease that no one could possibly have suspected anything. In that moment, what Gus saw was an ordinary married couple, perhaps even a happy one, sharing an ordinary morning at work. He told her that he had ordered a thorough investigation into the doctor, turning over every hidden corner of the man's life, and everything that came back was spotless, without a single blemish. There wasn't one complaint on record, not one occasion when the wife had been brought into an emergency room with suspicious injuries, not one sign in any document that anything unusual was happening behind the doors of the magnificent house in Roland Park. Every piece of evidence, every record, every cold number said the same thing, that nothing was wrong. And Gus, a man who had spent his whole life trusting evidence, trusting only what could be verified and measured, had believed those documents more than he had believed the instinct of an old woman nearing the end of her life. He paused for a moment, his eyes darkening beneath the weight of a regret that had been consuming him for longer than he could say. And then he spoke the bitterest truth of all. He had decided that his grandmother, at her age, exhausted and clouded by medication in her final days, must have been mistaken, must have imagined something that wasn't there, or turned an innocent bruise into an entire tragedy. He had convinced himself of that, folded away her final wish, placed it in a drawer, and walked away, allowing the work and calculations of his empire to carry him farther and farther from that 7th-floor hallway. Now, kneeling beside the woman who had been beaten so brutally inside the very home he had once believed to be peaceful, Gus lifted his eyes to hers, and within them lay an ocean of profound remorse. He said, each word heavy as stone, that his grandmother had been right from the very beginning, and he had been the one who was wrong. He had trusted lifeless pieces of paper, instead of believing the truth a compassionate heart had tried to warn him about. And the price of his mistake, he said, his voice thick with emotion, had been paid through all those long and endless months by her, not by him. At that very moment, while Gus's words of remorse still lingered in the air, Fitz, who had remained silently by the doorway until then, stepped forward carrying a thick file he had just retrieved from a safe hidden behind a painting in Brannon's study. He placed it in Gus's hands, and quietly said that this wasn't the sort of thing an ordinary gambling debtor kept hidden away. Gus began turning through the pages, his gaze growing sharper with each one, and what gradually emerged made even a man as seasoned as him draw his brows together. Brannon's enormous debt, it turned out, had nothing to do with the nights of gambling Gus had assumed were behind it. The esteemed doctor was one link in an intricate and ruthless operation, a network that arranged completely unnecessary surgeries for patients, dangerous procedures invented solely to extract enormous insurance payments, while another figure, someone far more powerful than Brannon, directed everything from above. The file in Gus's hands was the protection Brannon had secretly gathered and stored for his own survival, a double-edged weapon he intended to use to blackmail the very people behind the scheme, should they ever betray him, and because of that, it contained records of everything. A long list of patients who had died on the operating table, and whose medical records had been falsified to conceal the truth, along with the schedule of surgeries he was expected to perform in the coming weeks. Gus silently handed the file to Margaret, and guided by some vague instinct, she accepted it with trembling hands. Her eyes moved down the list of the dead, strangers who had lost their lives beneath the blade of greed, until her gaze suddenly stopped at the final line of the old record. There, printed clearly on a page yellowed with age, was her mother's name. Margaret's entire world seemed to stop turning in that instant. For years, she had believed her mother had died from an unforeseen complication during an unfortunate operation, only to discover now, on this cold sheet of paper, that her death hadn't been an accident at all, but part of the same criminal scheme in which Margaret's own husband was involved. She hadn't yet recovered from the shock when her trembling hand turned to the next page, and what she saw there made her heart feel as though an icy hand had closed around it. An additional line had been written in a different shade of ink, the handwriting more hurried, recording an upcoming operation, but the space for the patient's name had been left blank. There was only a scheduled date, and when Margaret calculated it, she realized it was less than 2 weeks after this terrible night. Gus noticed the change in her face. He took the surgical schedule, compared the room number and file code written beside that fateful date, and when he uncovered the identity of the patient whose name had been concealed, his entire expression darkened as well. The name was Theodore Delacroix, her brother. For a moment, Margaret couldn't breathe. Her mind spun as she struggled to understand why. And then each horrifying piece fell into place, forming a picture that sent a chill down her spine. Teddy was the only remaining blood relative of their mother, the only person in the world who still had the right to demand that the records surrounding her death be reopened. And as long as he remained alive, the secret the entire operation was desperate to bury could still be exposed. Beyond that, his status as a disabled man carried a substantial insurance policy that those cold-blooded people had surely set their sights upon. They had planned to make her brother the next victim on that fateful operating table. And it was that thought, the thought that Teddy, her precious younger brother with his bright eyes and mischievous smile, was in danger, that accomplished what no beating throughout all those years had ever managed to do. The tears on Margaret's face suddenly stopped. The pain and weakness within her receded, giving way to something else that began to rise, powerful and burning. And there, among the broken shards scattered across the floor, slowly but with unwavering determination, for the first time after all those years spent bowing her head and enduring in silence, Margaret forced herself upright and stood on her own 2 feet, without anyone's help. Standing upright amid the wreckage of the room, Margaret suddenly seemed to become someone else. And Gus, still on one knee, looked up at her with a new expression, one of respect. He slowly rose to his feet and, in the deep voice that had returned to its usual calm, asked her a question whose answer placed the power entirely in her hands. What she wanted him to do that very night, with the man cowering on the floor. In that moment, Gus gave her absolute authority, the right to decide the fate of the man who had tormented her for so many years, and the entire room held its breath as it waited. Margaret lowered her gaze to Brannon, to the pitiful creature trembling and begging with his eyes, the man who only moments before had still been the great terror of her life. She could have said anything, one word from her, and every pain, every humiliation, every long night spent bleeding in silence could have been returned to him 100,000 times over. But when she spoke, her voice didn't tremble, nor did it carry even the slightest trace of wild hatred. It was strangely calm and steady. She said that all her life she had sworn to save people, to hold the hands of those who were dying, not to send anyone to their death, and she wouldn't betray that vow, not even for a man like him, because if she did, she would turn herself into something like him with her own hands. She didn't want him to die, because death would be far too easy a release for a man like Brannon, a gentle escape from everything he deserved to endure. What she wanted, she said, every word clear and deliberate, was for him to live, to be dragged into the light of justice, to sit in a courtroom and listen as the name of every victim was read aloud, to face everything he had done. She wanted him to live a very long time in a world where no one would ever again dare place their life in those once celebrated hands, a world where the reputation for which he had traded away his soul would be taken from him forever. At those words, Gus gave a faint smile, brief but filled with deep understanding, the smile of a man who had just realized that he hadn't been mistaken about the person standing before him. This woman, even after reaching the farthest depths of suffering, still chose justice over revenge, still held on to a dignity no beating had ever been able to take from her. And with that, everything was decided. As the first light of dawn began to rise along the horizon after the storm, vehicles from the federal investigative authorities quietly arrived outside the house in Roland Park. Brannon was handed over to them along with the entire file of crimes he had so carefully preserved, and there wasn't a single injury on his body, not one mark suggesting that he had ever been in the hands of men from the criminal underworld. Before he was taken away, Gus stepped closer and bent down to speak a quiet sentence heavy with meaning, telling him that he had spent his life doing countless things outside the law, but there was one thing he had never done. He had never raised a hand against someone who couldn't fight back. And now Brannon would have many years in prison to consider the difference between the two of them. Brannon was handcuffed and led toward the door, but just before he crossed the threshold, he suddenly stopped and looked back at Margaret. A hoarse laugh rose from his throat, a chilling sound from a man who still believed he held one final card. With a crooked smile, he told her not to celebrate yet, not to be naive enough to think he was the end of it all, because he had only ever been the man who signed beneath someone else's orders. Then, he was pushed out into the morning mist, leaving those words hanging in the air behind him like a dangerous warning, a dark seed suggesting that beyond this curtain there was still another shadow neither Margaret nor Gus had ever seen. In the days that followed, Margaret was taken to recover at the Fontaine family's sprawling estate in Green Spring Valley, a place so peaceful that it seemed almost unreal to someone who had only just escaped from hell. All around her stretched open fields, rows of ancient trees, and a stillness she hadn't known in far too long. But the deepest wounds weren't upon her flesh, and no matter how peaceful the days might be, the nights still belonged to her nightmares. Time after time, Margaret woke with a start in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, her heart beating wildly, because in her dreams, she could once again hear heavy footsteps crossing the hardwood floor and see herself curled upon the cold tile. But whenever she opened her terrified eyes, she found a sight that slowly calmed her racing heart. In the corner of the room, beneath the warm golden circle of a reading lamp, Gus was still sitting quietly in an armchair with an open book in his hands. He didn't approach her, didn't speak, and asked nothing of her. He simply remained there, a silent assurance that she was safe, that no shadow would ever be able to reach her again. And it was that wordless presence, that distance preserved with such careful respect, that gradually began to mend the broken pieces of her spirit, more than any words of comfort could have done. Little by little, she recovered, color slowly returning to her face, and she began to find her way back to sleep. Yet anyone who has been imprisoned for too long becomes sensitive to every shape that control can take. One day, while visiting Teddy at Rosewood as she usually did, Margaret happened to notice a familiar car parked quietly across the street, with Fitz sitting inside. Then she realized it appeared there every time she came. A surge of anger mingled with fear rose inside her. Old memories came rushing back, and that evening she confronted Gus, her voice trembling with agitation, as she told him that her former husband had also sent men to follow her in exactly the same way, had watched every step she took, and that she couldn't endure being locked inside another cage, even if that cage were made of gold. Gus listened until she had finished without interrupting once, and only after she had emptied herself of all her anger did he calmly reply with words she would remember for the rest of her life. He said that the other man had people follow her so she couldn't go anywhere, so she would remain imprisoned, while he had people watch over her so she could go anywhere and still be safe. Those were two entirely different things, he told her. And then he looked directly into her eyes and added that if their presence made her feel trapped, she only had to say the word, and that very night he would call every one of them back without the slightest hesitation. It was his willingness to return her freedom, the one thing Brannon had never given her, that left Margaret speechless. She looked at him for a long time, and in that silence, she understood the difference between a chain and a shield. At last, she spoke softly, her voice barely more than a breath, and told him not to call them back. On another occasion, during a Fontaine family dinner around the long table, an elderly uncle named Bart voiced his displeasure, grumbling that Gus was taking a reckless risk by involving himself in the affairs of a strange woman and that it could bring trouble upon the entire family. Gus merely looked up, set down his knife and fork, and spoke a single sentence, quietly, yet with such cold authority that the entire table immediately fell silent. No one dared utter another word. And in that sudden stillness, everyone present understood clearly, without needing to be reminded, who truly held the power to decide what happened in that house. As her health and spirit gradually recovered, Margaret understood that she couldn't remain forever within the peace of the estate, that she needed to do something meaningful with the life still ahead of her. And so the idea of a home was born, a small palliative care clinic in East Baltimore, where some of the poorest people in the city lived, a place for those nearing the end of their lives who had no insurance, no money, and sometimes no family left at all. She named it Odette House, in memory of the woman who had rekindled the flame of compassion within her. Gus quietly stood behind her through everything, paying every expense and handling every document and procedure. But his name appeared nowhere, not on a sign, not in a single record, because to him, this was her dream, not his achievement. Odette House quickly became an extraordinarily warm place, somewhere death was met with tenderness instead of fear, and beneath the reception desk near the entrance, a gentle golden therapy dog named Biscuit could often be found curled up in peaceful sleep, always ready to press his warm head into the palm of anyone who needed comfort. It was there, during the days she spent caring for her patients, that Margaret met a remarkable elderly man. He had reached the final stage of his life, and she cared for him with the same devotion she had always given to everyone. One afternoon, as she adjusted his blanket, the old man suddenly took hold of her hand, his clouded eyes staring intently into hers, and asked whether her last name was Whitmore. When she quietly nodded, An expression of tormented pain crossed his face, and then he whispered that during his working years, he had been an anesthesia technician at the hospital, and that a terrible guilt had weighed upon his conscience for many years, something he had buried in silence because of cowardice and fear. He asked her to open the drawer beside his bed, where he had kept a video recording he had made long ago, a statement, a confession, and he pressed it into her hands, begging her to take it as his final attempt to atone for some part of what he had done before he closed his eyes for the last time. Margaret accepted the recording with trembling hands, her heart filled with countless conflicting emotions, and she hid it somewhere safe, not yet daring to watch it or even consider what she would do with it, because she knew that what she now possessed carried the force of a bomb. But the most devastating blow to her heart during that time didn't come from a stranger. It came from her own beloved younger brother. During one visit, Teddy directed his gaze toward a thick sketchbook and indicated that he wanted her to open it. Margaret began turning the pages, and what appeared before her left her speechless. Page after page, drawing after drawing, the same image had been created over and over again countless times throughout all those years. It showed a woman dressed in a nurse's uniform, standing completely alone beneath pouring rain, her arms wrapped around her own body as though searching for a little warmth, her entire figure radiating a loneliness and sorrow so profound that it tore at the heart. It was her. Her brother, who couldn't speak aloud, had used the only language available to him to see through everything she had struggled so desperately to hide from the rest of the world. Tears streamed down Margaret's face as she looked up at him, and Teddy, his own eyes red with tears, slowly typed one letter at a time on his screen. The machine's voice spoke softly, saying that he had drawn those pictures so she would see them, but she had never been willing to look. Those words shattered Margaret's heart, because she realized that throughout all the years she had devoted herself to concealing her pain in order to protect others. The person she loved most had been silently carrying that pain beside her, alone and without a word, hoping only that one day she would finally stop and see. That fateful night at Odette House began with a strange sound. Margaret was working the night shift, and in that peaceful refuge, there were only 2 patients asleep at the time, fragile souls whose safety had been entrusted to her care. Someone had slipped in under cover of darkness, a silent shadow easing through the back door, and his target wasn't human life, but the server in the records room, where all the files and all the evidence the figure behind the curtain so desperately wanted erased were being kept. While rummaging through the dark, the intruder accidentally knocked over a medical oxygen tank standing in the supply room, and in an instant, a small spark met the escaping gas and flared into flames that licked at the flammable materials nearby. The intruder fled in panic, leaving behind a fire that was growing by the second, and a thick wave of smoke beginning to coil through the building. When Margaret caught the burning smell and saw the gray smoke slipping through the crack beneath the storage room door, a flash of terror ran through her, but only for a brief moment. Then something else inside her immediately took over. Not fear, but the instinct of a woman who had spent so many years of her life wrestling life back from the edge in the direst of circumstances. She didn't panic. She didn't scream. She acted with the exact precision of procedures so deeply embedded in her bones that they had become part of her blood. The first thing she did was run to shut off the central oxygen valve, cutting off the fire's fuel and preventing it from surging into something far worse. Then she rushed into each room, and despite the smoke growing thicker by the moment, stinging her eyes and tightening her chest, she pulled each stretcher carrying her patients toward the emergency exit, using all the strength in her small body to push them through the smoke-choked hallway and out into the clean air. When both patients were finally safe on the sidewalk, she still didn't allow herself to collapse. She carefully counted everyone again, exactly as she had been trained to do, making certain that no one had been left behind. Only then did she realize that the skin on her left forearm had been caught by the flames, leaving a sharp and burning wound, but she hadn't even had time to think about it. Outside on the sidewalk, while they waited for the wail of ambulances to reach them from a distance, one of her 2 patients, an elderly woman with snowy white hair, trembled as she took Margaret's uninjured hand. The old woman looked at her with concern and softly asked if she was afraid. Margaret looked back at her, and instead of offering one of the reassuring lies she knew so well, she nodded honestly and said in a quiet voice that yes, she was afraid. At that, the old woman smiled, a toothless, understanding smile, and told her something Margaret would carry with her forever, that it was a good thing because only people who had nothing left in this world were the ones who didn't know fear, while Margaret, because she could still feel fear, still had precious things left to protect, still had reasons to keep living. Those simple words made Margaret's nose sting with sudden tears. Gus arrived when everything had settled, when the fire had already been extinguished, and the flashing lights of emergency vehicles had surrounded the place. He stepped out of the car with his heart clenched in fear, and then he stopped still, because what he saw wasn't a helpless woman waiting to be rescued. What he saw was Margaret, her face streaked with soot, and her arm wrapped in a makeshift bandage, calmly bending down to comfort and reassure her patients, in that same gentle voice she always carried. And in that moment, standing at a distance and watching her in silence, Gus finally understood something essential about this woman. She had never needed a hero to rush in and pull her out of the fire. What she needed, what she had lacked for her entire life, was simply someone willing to remain beside her and face the fire with her. A few days after the fire, when Margaret had returned to the estate to recover from the burn on her arm, she happened to pass Gus's study late one evening and stopped without meaning to, because the door stood slightly open and she could hear him speaking on the telephone. His voice carried the same deep, steady calm it always did, so composed that anyone might have mistaken the conversation for an ordinary business matter, and it was precisely that composure, set beside the meaning of his words, that made Margaret hold her breath and remain motionless. He was speaking about the man who had knocked over the oxygen tank and caused the fire that night, the man who had nearly taken the lives of her patients, and in a brief voice, he asked the person at the other end whether the man had any children. After a moment of silence while he listened to the answer, Gus slowly gave his orders, saying that in that case, they weren't to touch the man's body, weren't to harm so much as a single hair on his head, but should strike at other things instead. They were to go after his bank accounts, his professional license, and his passport, and make certain that he remained alive, but was reduced to a man with nothing, without even a cent left to his name. Standing outside the door, Margaret felt something strange rise within her, a mixture of fear and something very close to understanding. She was afraid because she had just witnessed another side of this man, the side of a kingpin who could destroy an entire human life with only a few softly spoken words, without guns, without knives, without blood. Yet at the same time, she understood. She realized that even within the dark and ruthless world over which Gus ruled, he had drawn a line for himself that he would never cross, that he wouldn't force innocent children to bear the suffering caused by adults, and wouldn't leave a child without a father because of that father's crimes. He was a frightening man, yet he possessed a strange moral code she couldn't help but respect. Not long afterward, Gus went directly to the lair of the mastermind, the man who controlled the entire criminal operation. The one Brannon had implied was the person truly signing the orders. But he didn't bring an entourage, and he carried no weapon. He chose to meet the man alone in an old, decaying church in Fells Point, a silent place where only rows of dust-covered wooden pews remained beneath the dim light filtering through faded, stained glass windows. Gus entered empty-handed, a deliberate lack of weapons that was itself the purest display of power, because only a man completely certain of his position would dare enter a tiger's den without even a blade of steel to protect him. He sat down in one of the pews and placed a file beside him, and when the mastermind appeared, Gus didn't raise his voice or threaten him. He merely slid the file calmly toward the man and offered him 3 paths from which to choose. What mattered was that among those 3 choices, the most brutal course, the one a kingpin like him could easily have chosen to settle everything permanently, was the very option Gus had crossed out with his own hand. He had considered it, but then rejected it, not because he lacked the ability or the ruthlessness to carry it through, but for an entirely different reason. He knew that if he stained his hands with blood, the eyes of the woman at Odette House would never look at him the same way again, and to Augustine Fontaine, the way she looked at him had now become more precious than every act of vengeance in the world. Then, the day of the trial arrived. The day when justice was finally dragged into the light after so many years buried in darkness. Inside the solemn, cold federal courtroom, amid the expensive suits of the attorneys and the tense faces of the defendants, Margaret entered not in an elegant dress meant to prove that she had risen again, but in her own simple pale blue nursing uniform. It was a deliberate choice, a silent declaration that she had come not as a victim seeking pity, but as the person she had always been, a woman who had devoted her life to caring for and protecting others. The trial unfolded under intense strain, And then a witness stepped onto the stand whose appearance left even Margaret stunned. It was Adeline Barnaby, the elderly head nurse with the sharp eyes whose gaze Margaret had avoided for so long. She stood there with her back straight, her voice calm but resolute, and began to reveal a truth no one had expected. She testified that throughout the years she had worked beside Margaret, she had recognized early on that something was wrong, and she hadn't remained silent as Margaret had always believed. Time after time, she had quietly written reports and submitted them to the hospital's Human Resources Department, setting down her suspicions. But every time, those reports had vanished without a trace, smothered before they could go any further by some powerful hand within the institution, because the person behind everything had a reach far greater than anyone could have imagined. Then, when every official path had been sealed shut, when she realized that the system she had trusted throughout her life could never save that young woman, she had done something that violated every principle by which she had lived. She picked up the telephone and called a man at the harbor. The entire courtroom fell silent as the old woman lifted her head and said that she had worked as a nurse for nearly her entire life, that she possessed more than enough experience to distinguish between an injury caused by an accidental fall and one that could never have come from falling. She said that she had always done everything according to procedure, according to the rules, but those procedures had never saved anyone. So in the end, she chose to break the rules, and she declared that it was the only thing she had ever done in her entire career that allowed her to sleep soundly every night when she looked back upon it. Hearing those words, Margaret turned around in shock and searched through the crowd until her eyes met Gus's, where he sat quietly in the back row. In that moment, the final pieces fell into place, and she understood that the night he had knocked on her door hadn't been entirely a coincidence arranged by fate. It had also been the result of a desperate call from a decent woman who no longer knew where else to turn. Gus gave her only a slight nod, a gesture that carried 1,000 explanations. And just when it seemed the shock had begun to settle, the prosecutor presented one final piece of evidence. The large screen in the courtroom came to life, and upon it appeared the face of the elderly anesthesia technician, the patient Margaret herself had cared for during his final days at Odette House. From the recording, in a weak and breathless but unmistakably clear voice, the dead man described in detail everything he had witnessed, everything in which he had been complicit, and everything that had tormented his conscience for so many years. It was an accusation echoing back from beyond the grave, the testimony of a man who no longer belonged to this world, and because of that, no defense attorney and no cunning excuse could challenge it or shake its truth. When the recording ended, and the courtroom remained submerged in breathless silence, Margaret was called to the stand to read the victim's statement on behalf of those whose voices had been silenced forever. She stood there in her nursing uniform, holding the sheet of paper in both hands, and in a calm, clear voice, she began to read, one name at a time. Each name that echoed through that solemn space wasn't a lifeless number in a file, but a human being, a destiny, a life stolen by greed. She read slowly, allowing every name enough time to resonate and settle into the minds of everyone present, and with each one spoken aloud, the air in the courtroom seemed to grow a little heavier until she reached the final name. When her eyes fell upon that line, her voice faltered for a moment, because it was her mother's name. She lifted her head, and before the eyes of the entire court, she slowly removed the watch from her left wrist, the wrist she had used for years to conceal everything. Beneath the watch band was a plastic hospital bracelet, yellowed with age, a patient identification band she had quietly preserved and carried with her ever since that fateful day in childhood, the last keepsake of the mother she had lost. She raised it for everyone to see, and spoke her mother's name aloud, bringing the list of the dead to its end. From the defendant's bench, Brannon watched her every movement, searching within that figure for some trace of the frightened, fragile woman he had once believed he had broken completely. But that woman no longer existed. The person standing before him now was someone entirely different, steady and untouchable. Margaret turned and looked directly into his eyes, and she told him, not with hatred but with a strange and profound serenity, that she forgave him. She made it clear that she wasn't doing so because he deserved forgiveness, but because she had decided she wouldn't carry him with her for even one more day. She would set down the burden that bore his name and walk forward with lighter shoulders, and it was that forgiveness, rather than any curse she might have spoken, that delivered the final blow and caused Brannon to collapse, because he understood that he had lost every last trace of power over her. The final sentence was handed down, a punishment worthy of his crimes, and with it, The medical license he had worshipped above human life was permanently revoked. But the story didn't end there. After the trial concluded, while the crowd was dispersing, a federal agent quietly approached Gus. He thanked him for helping investigators expose a murderer disguised as a healer, but then added something with a deeper implication, saying that through this case, they had also discovered a notable truth, that Gus possessed the ability to remove every confidential record from a private hospital in the course of a single night. An underground empire like the Fontaine families had survived for so long because no one had ever chosen to examine it too closely, and now Gus himself had forced them to look. The words were a courteous warning, a sign that the investigative files concerning his family, long since closed, would now be opened again. Standing nearby, Margaret heard everything, and only then did she fully understand the price that man had quietly paid for her. To bring the evidence into the light, to win justice for her and for her mother, he had drawn back the curtain that protected his own kingdom, and willingly placed part of the empire he had spent his life building at risk. Yet he had never spoken a word about it. When she turned to him, her eyes filled with emotion and remorse, Gus only shook his head gently. In his deep, composed voice, he told her never to believe that he had traded her for the harbor. The truth was exactly the opposite, he said. He had offered the entire harbor in exchange for the chance to redeem one night, the night months earlier when he had seen her pain and had cowardly turned his back and walked away. Winter came early that year, and on the night when the first snowflakes began to fall and cover the estate in white, Margaret stood quietly by the window, watching the world outside slowly wrap itself in a garment of purity. When Gus came to stand beside her holding an old photograph, he told her softly that there was something he needed to show her, something he had happened to find while reviewing old records connected to his own family's lawsuit from years before. The photograph had originally been taken as evidence, capturing a hospital corridor many years ago, on the fateful night her mother died. Margaret took the picture, and her eyes moved across the painfully familiar scene until they stopped at a small corner of the image. There, on a plastic chair set against the wall, sat a little girl curled up alone, her tiny figure nearly swallowed by the vast and freezing corridor. It was her, but what stole Margaret's breath wasn't the sight of the child she had once been, but the detail around the girl's wrist. On that small wrist, there wasn't only one patient bracelet, but two. For a moment, the entire world seemed to stop, and a fragment of memory buried for so many years suddenly began to open. She had never remembered it, not once in her life, but now the truth slowly came into focus. On the night her mother died, the shock had been so overwhelming that the child Margaret had collapsed as well and had to be admitted to the hospital, and her young mind, trying to protect itself, had quietly erased that entire terrible stretch of memory. She had always believed she had been completely alone that night, abandoned and forgotten. But the photograph told another story. Someone had stayed beside her. Someone had sat down next to the little girl, trembling with fear and pain, and, in a gentle voice, softly sung a quiet lullaby to soothe her through the panic, carrying the very same warmth her mother had once given her. Margaret's entire life, it turned out, had followed a miraculous circle. For so many years, she had devoted herself to being a nurse, remaining beside strangers in their final moments so they wouldn't have to leave this world alone, believing all the while that she was the one giving. But in truth, she had only been quietly returning something she herself had once received, an act of kindness she had forgotten had ever been given to her on the darkest night of her life. Tears streamed down her cheeks, and Gus stood there watching her in silence, before softly asking whether she still remembered the question his grandmother had asked before she closed her eyes for the last time. Margaret looked up, her voice breaking with emotion, and said that Odette had asked whether anyone had ever sung for her. Gus nodded, and in his dark brown eyes, usually so calm and controlled, there now shone a tenderness she had never seen before. In a deep and sincere voice, he told her that he didn't know how to sing, that he had never been a man of songs or music, but there was one thing he could do. He could stay. He could sit beside her every night for the rest of his life, if she would allow him to. Hearing those words, Margaret smiled through her tears, a smile of peace she had taken far too long to find again. She looked directly into his eyes and told him that from now on, he must never speak of debts or repayment again, because there had never been any debt between them. Instead, she said, he should simply ask her for a place to sit beside her. Not long afterward, on a peaceful morning at Odette House, as the early sunlight streamed through the windows, Margaret opened the small notebook in which she recorded the names of those she had accompanied through death. the notebook that had remained with her for so many years. On the very first page, she fell still when she saw the words written there. Her own name, the name she had once written in pencil and crossed out as though surrendering herself to fate, had now been written again, this time in dark, clear ink, in the strong and certain handwriting of a man. She didn't need to ask who had written it. She simply reached out and touched the letters, smiling, because she understood that her name now belonged among the living and no longer remained on the list of those waiting to let go. And so the story of the nurse from the 7th floor came to an end, leaving all of us with something worth remembering, that kindness is never lost when we give it to someone else. It is like a seed that may lie quietly beneath dark soil for many years, only to sprout and bloom on the day we least expect it, sometimes in the very place where hope once seemed impossible, beneath the hand of a man feared by an entire city. Life may sometimes push us into darkness, but we must never lose our compassion or our faith, because every quiet act of goodness we offer today may become the light that saves us, or someone else, tomorrow. If this story touched your heart, please press the like button, share this video with those you love, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so that each day you can hear more meaningful and moving stories. What did you think of Margaret and Augustine's story, and of their journey from darkness back into the light? Please leave a few words in the comments below, because we're always eager to hear the sincere emotions that come from the depths of your hearts. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story until the very final moment. We wish everyone watching this video abundant health, a joyful and peaceful life, and happiness filling every day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the stories to come.